Pushkin.
Hey there, Justin Richmond here. The world is changing all around us, and this new reality demands new approaches to just about every aspect of our lives. How we work, invest, travel, entertain, educate, socialize, and how we look after ourselves will basically become all but unrecognizable in the next 5 to 10 years. But don't worry, there's a podcast for that. Disruptors, an RBC podcast, explores how innovation helps us step boldly into the next phase of the economy. Hosted by best-selling author and thought leader John Stackhouse, Disruptors shines a light on cutting-edge technologies, innovative adaptations, and new tactics for doing business. It's all about looking for exciting ways to build our future through great audio storytelling and in-depth conversations. Disruptors helps Canada and the world thrive by highlighting the creative power of disruptive ideas.
This episode is brought to you by Square. Just as we're all trying to adapt to everything going on this year, small business owners everywhere are having to figure out new ways of doing business. If you run a business and are thinking about shifting online, Square can help with tools like a free online store. Set it up in minutes so your customers can shop from anywhere with pickup, delivery, or shipping. Once you're up and running, Square can help you promote your new online store with tools for social ads and email marketing. Everything works together, all from one place. You just need a Square account to get started. See all the ways that Square can help at square.com/go/rules. Hello, Against the Rules listeners. It's Michael Lewis here. I recently went on Axios Today to talk about presidential transitions. I wrote extensively about the Trump administration's botched transition in my book, The Fifth Risk, about what happens when people given control of our government have no idea how it works or interest in finding out, and what happens when they won't give up control of the government. Axios Today is the daily news show that gets you smarter, faster. Host Niala Boodhoo's conversations with journalists like Mike Allen and Margaret Talev and Jonathan Swan and Alexi McAmmond offer reporting and analysis that you just don't hear anywhere else. I hope you'll find this episode meaningful, and if you like it, please listen to Axios Today wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Michael.
How are you?
I am okay. I wonder, how did you get interested in this whole idea of transitions in the first place? I think that when people think about transitions, they do think about, when the car pulls up to the White House and the president and the president's spouse get out and then they shake hands, and people think that's what the transition is.
So I got interested the day after Trump was elected. And Steve Bannon announced that they were going to toss all the transition books prepared by the Obama administration into the garbage can. And Trump fired his many hundreds of persons transition team that had been carefully assembled by Chris Christie. Then I kind of asked, what is this thing they decided not to show up for? Our government is different from the government in other democracies in that it is, even though it gets accused of being the deep state, it's actually quite a shallow state in some ways, that we have more than 4,000 political appointees who come in to actually run the thing. And so there is not a permanent leadership in the same way there are in other civil services. And the problem is continuity, that you don't have a continuity in management or leadership. And so you got new people coming in to run this whole thing. And they often have no idea what it is they're taking charge of. So let's take an example. This is what really piqued my interest in writing The Fifth Risk. Rick Perry had been a presidential candidate who got on stage and said during a presidential debate that he was going to eliminate 3 departments in the federal government. He couldn't remember their names, but he was going to do it. And afterwards he named them, and one of them was the Department of Energy. Now, Donald Trump, instantly after he's elected, appoints Rick Perry to be in charge of the Department of Energy, which he has said he's going to eliminate. At which point, Rick Perry admits he actually has no idea what goes on in the Department of Energy. And lo and behold, what goes on in the Department of Energy is they manage the nuclear arsenal, among other things. Just things that are critical to the society. At which point, Rick Perry backpedals furiously and says, this place is absolutely critical and we're going to keep it and I'm going to run it. But now you see there's a problem, right? You've got a guy who clearly doesn't know what he's running. And if he doesn't show up to listen to what the people going out have been through the last 4 or 8 years, or listen to the civil service about what the problems are, you've got incompetence and ignorance just waiting to cause trouble.
You spent so much time talking to these people about how they were preparing for a transition. Can you give us a sense of what that involved?
Sure. So any place you went in the government, you could find things that were being done that if they weren't done would be very disturbing to the American people. They just don't pay much attention to what's going on in these places. And your point is well taken, that people think when they think transition, they think the White House. They don't realize that actually it's the entire federal bureaucracy, the entire federal government is being handed over. And by law, there's actually a law that requires the administration to prepare for this moment of handoff. And the Bush administration, for example, had been very, very diligent in preparing to hand the government over to the Obama administration. And Obama was very grateful for how they did that. So they get up to speed very quickly on the problems they were dealing with, like, for example, a global financial crisis. The Obama administration had done the same thing for the Trump administration. So there are these briefing books. Let's say you're taking over the nuclear arsenal. There's a dude in a room who's been managing the nuclear arsenal. It does require management, that you don't want the bombs going off when you don't want them to go off, and you want them to be able to go off when you want them to go off. You have, among other things, billions of dollars of projects in nuclear waste cleanup underneath you. You have complicated programs that you are managing. And there are these books that you've created to explain to the people who are going to take over from you how you've been doing it. And so what had happened 4 years ago that was so peculiar was that a journalist, could walk into any one of these departments, find something that was actually critical, like the feeding of 30 million school children every day, and be the first person to have received the briefing how this was done. There was no interest from one side to the other. Now the situation's reversed. The outgoing administration has no interest in preparing to hand over the government to the incoming administration. And it's a different problem, right? And I'm watching it from a distance rather than reporting on it now. But it is a different kind of problem, and there are maybe more workarounds here than there were the last time.
I wonder if we can play some audio for you to kind of get you back to 4 years ago. And this is that moment of the handover between President Obama to Donald Trump.
Well, I just had the opportunity to have an excellent conversation with President-elect Trump. It was wide-ranging. We talked about some of the organizational issues in setting up a White House. We talked about foreign policy. We talked about domestic policy. And as I said last night, my number one priority in the coming 2 months is to try to facilitate a transition that ensures our president-elect is successful.
So that's a different spirit, right? That's a spirit of someone who's actually trying to operate in the spirit of the government and trying to actually make sure that bad things don't happen because the incoming administration wasn't prepared by the outgoing administration. So now we have a slightly different situation where the president doesn't even want to acknowledge he's lost, for starters, but beyond that seems to be kind of intent on withholding as much as possible. And there are a couple things that come to mind when I watch what's happening. One is, they're obviously like just facts you need to know that are maybe classified that you can't get access to that will be a problem for the Biden administration. But there are lots of like little just practical things. I saw one just the other day. So the Biden administration is going to have to manage the pandemic. I was in the office of a friend over at University of California, San Francisco the other day. And in his office, he had, 10,000 of these Abbott Lab rapid COVID tests. Take 15 minutes to do it. He had them, because the federal government had bought the first 150 million of these things and, not knowing what to do with them, had shipped them off to the states at a per capita basis. And the states didn't know what to do with them, and they weren't even sure they worked. So they'd sent them to UCSF to test them. And in fact, they do work very well. Now, it's one little piece of the COVID response. There are 1,000 things like this. The Biden administration probably does not even know those things are out there or where they are or, what the state of play with them is, how they might be used. If you have 150 million really rapid COVID tests, there are obviously smarter places to put it than others. There are places where you get more leverage out of them. But you can't even begin to think of that unless you have been briefed about these things.
I wonder, how much of this chaos that we're seeing now you think stems from not just that 2016 transition, but as you explored all of this, the folks that were coming in from the Trump administration really seem to have an attitude that the way the government is right now is just wrong and people are doing things wrong. And it doesn't make sense to listen to the people who have been doing this for however long they've been doing it for.
But the minute you got into any kind of specifics, it just kind of broke down. I mean, all right, it's wrong how the nuclear arsenal is being managed. Please explain. And in many cases, they weren't actually proposing a different policy. They were just proposing to be more negligent in the way they managed it. Now, there were obviously there were strains to this government, more than one thing going on. Yes, it was true that there were things going on in the federal government they just wanted to shut down, like, for example, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But there are other places like, for example, managing a pandemic or managing the nuclear arsenal or managing nuclear waste cleanup or whatever it is, or distributing school lunches, which they didn't propose to get rid of, or running the National Weather Service or collecting taxes that they weren't proposing to do away with. In fact, they weren't even proposing to do it any differently. But even in those cases, they showed no interest in kind of getting briefed up on this. The third strain was there were cases, and the Weather Service was an example of this, where there was actually private companies that had an interest in making it difficult for the government to do its job so that they could extract more profit from the marketplace. It was a hodgepodge of things. It wasn't one ideology here at work. And on top of it all, the big thing was there was a president who was perfectly happy to govern in ignorance. In fact, in a funny way, he elevated it to a principle. And to the extent he could keep everybody as confused and in the dark as he was, we were all playing on the same field. But he seemed to operate almost from a position that he already knew everything. In fact, that's what he'd said. He'd said to Chris Christie, who had managed his transition team, when Christie said, this is a big thing, Donald. It's a 2 million person operation that you're going to have to run, and you've never run anything bigger than your little company. That he said, Chris, everything you and I need to know about running the government, we can learn by taking an hour away from the victory party. Now, if that's your attitude, I mean, really the only way you're going to proceed is not to pay much attention to it. Because in fact, it's an enormously complicated task. It's not like it's easy for anybody. In some ways, the job is undoable, that you come in cold. You got to appoint 4,000 people to run this whole operation, get many of them confirmed by the Senate that is hostile to you. Very hard to hire and fire people in the federal government. Everybody knows you're there at most 8 years. It's a management challenge even in the best of times. When you throw into that, like the people who are handing it off to you are going to obscure from your view everything you need to know to manage it well, I mean, you're just asking for trouble. You just don't know what the trouble is.
So I think in many ways, the fifth risk is kind of like this love letter to bureaucracy and to the federal government. There's so many stories of relationships of people that you met. I think people don't think about the fact that the National Weather Service is there to provide tornado warnings or hurricane warnings.
They take the progress for granted. Your weather predictions, your weather forecasts are so much better than they were a generation ago, and then were better than they were the generation before that. And there's a reason for that. And the effect of that is huge. I mean, the effect on commerce, the effect on human life, the ability to, pinpoint where the hurricane is going to hit land. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it's driven entirely or almost entirely by the government's work in the area. Now, there's been help from the private sector, but the government is at the center of the collection and analysis of weather data that led to the progress in weather prediction. And we just take it all for granted. And we don't think, who did that? Who were the people who threw themselves into that enterprise? And when you dig into it, you find, it was the woman who was a 10-year-old girl was traumatized because in a hurricane a tree fell on her house, and she said, "I want to make sure that doesn't happen to other people. I'm gonna learn how to predict the weather." You find these very curious characters who are drawn to the mission, and sometimes the stories are quite moving. I mean, there's a guy in the book. He's named Arthur Allen, who was laid off during the government shutdown, who's in the Coast Guard, who basically invented a way to predict the way objects drift at sea, depending on the object. So if you're on a life raft versus a life preserver versus a 18-foot sailboat, enabling the Coast Guard to find thousands of people who were lost at sea that they never would have found otherwise. I mean, there's a guy who saved thousands of lives, and he did it without anybody asking him to do it, just because he got an interest in it while working in the government job. This guy's laid off as an unnecessary worker during the government shutdown. I mean, there's story after story that just doesn't get out there because the government is not allowed to market itself, and it doesn't promote itself, unlike every other sector in the society. The book, yes, it is a bit of a love letter, but it didn't start that way. It started out with me just wondering what happens if people don't show up who are going to run this place to learn what happens inside of it. And I was just shocked by the caliber and the passion of the people I met. And that's it is a side effect of this transition, of what's going on right now, and a side effect of the entire Trump administration. But one of the side effects is to send a signal to those people that, you stuck your neck out for the society and now we're going to chop your head off, or we don't honor what you did for us. And that's just a great shame. For me, that's the biggest shame of the Trump administration.
Do you think that is reflected in the fact that he lost the election? If you look at polling, how much people felt the way the coronavirus has been handled was a significant factor in how people voted.
Well, I was betting when I was working on the book that his managerial ineptitude was much more important than people were crediting, and that something would happen. I didn't know what it was. But one way to frame the federal government is a manager of a portfolio of risks, and some of these risks are existential risks. Something always happens, right? You never know what it is. But the presidents don't get to sit there and coast for 4 years. Something happens. And that when it happened, he would be unprepared to manage it because of his approach to the enterprise. And because of, his approach to the enterprise is reflective of deeper problems. But yes, I think he lost the election because of his approach to government. People might not put it quite that way, but put it another way. Let us say he was a Mussolini who could actually make the trains run on time, that he actually had management ability, along with everything else he's got, anti-democratic impulses, all that he actually could make the trains run on time, that he actually could run a pandemic effectively. He'd still be president. He'd have won. And so, yes, it ended up being his Achilles heel, not paying attention to the enterprise that he was supposed to manage.
Now we're sort of in this in-between period, and now we're also seeing a lot of firings. The defense secretary, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, just to mention a few. I mean, these are important roles. I wonder just sort of what implications you think this period has, not just thinking about President Trump obstructing President-elect Biden, but also the people who are here.
Well, I don't know what it means for Trump to fire somebody right now. I don't know if they're really fired. They're fired for 2 months. I don't know. They can come back. I don't. What effect would it have on me if I was in one of these enterprises? It'd probably be just to lay low until the guy's gone. Because why attract attention to yourself? You might be the next one to be fired. But I don't think it would stop me from having the conversations that I would need to have with the Biden administration if I felt they needed to know stuff. So I assume a lot of people feel that way. Seems like the natural way to feel. I could be wrong about this. I think of these kind of managerial moves he's making now as farce and theater that actually they're not going to make that much of a difference in the end. You're removing people from jobs for a couple of months. It just seems like noise. It just seems like noise and distraction.
I wonder if we can end by cutting through that noise and distraction by you just sort of sharing what are the most important things that you would like to be seeing happening now, that even if they're not happening, what should be happening?
I think if we backed away from this and asked, what should we all learn? We really shouldn't be at the mercy of one man like this. There shouldn't be 4,500 people to be appointed by the president to run the civil service. We should have a deeper state. We should have upper level management positions in all these agencies that are permanent civil service. We should convert a lot of the political positions to civil service positions so that it's just the transition's less critical. That the expertise at the top stays, much of it, and that every department has its Tony Fauci. So the handoff is just not that as big a deal. And also, I mean, think of what the Biden administration is having to do. How much easier it would be if it was 200 people they needed to put in, and only at the very top. And underneath the very top, you had these people who actually knew what was going on in the enterprises, who were actually managing it. I think that's my takeaway. My takeaway is we need to reform the government so that it is easier to manage and it looks more like other enterprises in the society that are successfully run.
Actually, but I think Trump supporters, people who voted for him because they said he's a businessman and he knows how to run a company and he will clean up the swamp, would agree with you. So what would you say to those people about the way the government has not just been run for the past 4 years, but needs to be reformed in the way that you're talking about?
You just explain it. The problem is it's not explained. So if you look very broadly at Trump's support, what's like the first few things you notice about it, aside from race and gender? You notice where they live. It's rural. Rural America is the most dependent on the American government of any part of America. Rural America, above all, would welcome a better run federal government because they're at the mercy of it. You just need to explain how. The problem is it's a civics and public education problem, I think. We don't have that conversation. We shout at each other a lot. I think someone willing to teach and lead by teaching, I think absolutely could deliver this message.
So you wrote the book a couple of years ago. I wonder what stories have stayed with you of the people that you mentioned a few, but are there any more?
A person who I would think is sort of like you need one of him in every department. John McWilliams, who is the first person I go see at the Department of Energy. He's just out of the Department of Energy when I started the book. And he was a private sector guy. He was a guy that lots of people who hate the government would still find ways to admire him. He'd made millions of dollars as a private equity person. He knew the energy sector really well. He was a successful investor and a money manager. And he was brought in as a risk manager inside the Department of Energy. And his job was to run around the whole place and figure out what are the risks we're managing. And he stopped at 138. And every one of them seemed terrifying when you sat down and talked to him. He knew nothing about the government when he came into the job. He came away shocked by the talent that was still inside the Department of Energy and by the energy and the ambition, and it was just directed at something other than making money. But also shocked at the fact that no one had put names to these risks. Some of the risks are quite slow-moving risks, like the risk of underinvesting in science and technology. Long-term science projects are being funded in the Department of Energy that won't be funded by the private sector. The future of the economy is being funded in part by the Department of Energy. He's interesting as a person, but that character intrigues me as someone who we could use everywhere in the government. And then have that person explain publicly what it is we need to be thinking about and worrying about.
What do you think when we're thinking about the risks, and I'm just thinking about that guy listing all of those risks, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And of course, that's the number one risk, right, for Joe Biden on January 20th. But what's at the top of the list?
The top of the list is whatever you're not thinking about. Because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, I promise you, if you and I sit down in 4 years, some things will have happened that we could never have imagined. But someone in the government is in charge of imagining it and thinking about it and preparing for it and making us slightly better at responding to it. They should have been able to guess that we would be crippled by a bug, right? A few people said things about it, but wasn't on the top of mind 4 years ago that we're all going to be, cowering in our homes because there's this new cold virus going around. There's a similar unimaginable thing on the horizon. We would do well to buttress the people who in the government whose job it is to prepare us for those things. And we didn't do it in this case. I mean, we quite clearly didn't do it in this case. And beyond that, we didn't empower them after the fact. I mean, Trump did things that gutted our ability to respond to this thing, but it was much more what he did after the thing was upon us that was so disturbing. And even now, we are arguing about whether government is a solution to the problem. Even now, we alone in the world, think about this, alone in the world are fighting about whether you should be wearing masks or congregating in large numbers and so on and so forth. And this is the thing that's just, to me, just unbelievably bewildering and telling. We are the inventors of pandemic planning. The Center for Disease Control was, in effect, the World Health Organization. We have the leading scientists. We're leaders in medicine. We should be the A-team in responding to a pandemic. That we have 4 and something percent of the world's population and 20 and something percent of the world's deaths is a spectacular indictment of our relationship to our government. There's no other explanation than that for our failure. We should be winning the pandemic and we're losing it.
Michael Lewis is a journalist, best-selling author, and he's also host of the Pushkin podcast, Against the Rules. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for having me. Axios Today is the daily news show that gets you smarter, faster. Please listen to Axios Today wherever you get your podcasts. Stay safe and be well.